I am so, gosh, it's been way long overdue that I'm here with Gwen, Athene, Tarbox. I am so happy, so excited to learn from you today, Gwen.
Great. It's wonderful to be here. I've had a lot of fun looking at some of the other programs. You do a wonderful job as an interviewer, so I'm looking forward to it.
So, Gwen, I was reading your latest book, and before we jump into your as we jump into your kind of origin story here, and you acknowledge Nan and Joe as really kind of like opening or allowing you to kind of pursue comics as a passion, as a joy, and then finally, of course, today as a scholar. Maybe we can start with that.
Sure. My mother was born in 1937, Nancy, and her sister Kay was born, actually, my Aunt Kay was born in 37, my mom was born in 38, and my grandfather, Joe, was just absolutely loved comics. He reveled in them. He read them to his kids with all the voices. He would do voices. And he was, a shop worker and a welder and, an electrician. He wasn't a literary scholar or a visual arts scholar, but he loved comics. And my mom and my Aunt Kay both read comics voraciously. They were part of that generation that grew up in the 40s and early 50s who read so many comics. And my mom especially loved Wonder Woman. That was her thing. Wonder Woman and Nancy Drew for my mom were just major role models. So, of course, when I came along, comics were a part of my life too. My father used to walk with me to our local news agent back in the day when we still had those, and he would buy me a Hershey's bar and a comic book, and he would get the New York Times and a Hershey bar with almonds. And we would walk home, and then my mom would have already been at home with the Detroit Free Press with the funny pages. And so I would read the New York Times, but I would also read the funny pages. And in that same store, the person who owned it was named Cy. And I've talked to a bunch of my friends who grew up in this neighborhood in Flint, Michigan, and we cannot remember his last name. But he was a lovely person, and he knew that we kids didn't have a ton of money. And so I would come in and buy some candy, and then he would let me sit in the back and read comics. And at the time, I liked Animal Funny Comics and Richie Rich. But the comic that really changed my whole attitude about everything was Mad Magazine. This was in the early 70s during the Watergate era. And I don't know if you're younger than I am, I think, but for those of us who grew up then, I think we have a kind of skewed memory about it because I think we thought that the newspapers covered Watergate. But really, it was just the Washington Post and the New York Times for a long time. And I did some research because I was interested in how the Flint Journal covered it. And it turns out that there's very little coverage of it. Where I was getting most of my news about Watergate was from Mad Magazine. Their political commentary fascinated me. I became obsessed with political cartoons, not just then in Mad, but in general. I asked my parents about it, and this was back when you had to go and use a card catalog. But I also was able to find some reprints of Punch, the British satire magazine from especially from the 19th century. And so that interest was there early on, but there was something else that happened with Mad, Frederick, that also sort of changed how I interacted with comics. And that was back in the 70s, Mad was also just absolutely festooned with all sorts of scantily clad women. And as a 10-year-old kid, I loved the satire, but I was uncomfortable, even then, although I didn't have the language to express it, with the way that women were portrayed in the magazine. And in fact, in some ways that combined with the way that women were portrayed in the Underground Comix that my dad would sometimes read, sort of turned me off comics for a while. So I must admit, I've listened to some of the other people who have been interviewed by you, and they've talked about, going into adolescence reading comics, but with the exception of the comics in the papers, which I read every day, and I had collections of like Calvin and Hobbes or Peanuts, but I really stopped reading comics until probably the middle of grad school in the 1990s. I still was interested in art and visual theory, but then my professor, my my dissertation advisor, Wendy Stallard-Flora, was one of the first U.S. academics to write extensively on mouse. And she brought Art Spiegelman to campus, to Purdue, where I was, and she encouraged me to get back into visual culture, and or at least to take comics seriously. And basically, when I hit a certain point where I'd been writing on girls' culture for a long time and I wanted to do something with visual theory, I came back to comics. So that's sort of my origin story. It started off with a big bang, but then it sort of petered out a little bit until the 2000s, really.
Yeah, I love that. And wow, that it was kind of in the water that you were drinking as a kid. I love it. And I also love the way, there is something about childhood and comics for children that generates this kind of warmth. But I love that you shared this activity, this kind of ritual with your grandfather. Is beautiful. Speaking of dissertations and your work at Purdue and then your book, tell us about this work on progressive era girl fiction, and especially Nancy Drew.
Well, I actually started off as a British modernist scholar. Then I moved to American Studies, which is why I ended up at Purdue, because they had a really strong American Studies program. And originally I was going to write a dissertation on Sylvia Plath, a psychobiography of Sylvia Plath. And I went to Smith College to do research in their library. And two things happened there. One is I discovered some things in the diary, and the diaries that are printed in the public are not the same as the diaries that are at Smith. The diaries at Smith are more comprehensive, and some of the entries that have been left out are from when Plath was far younger, and yet was actually showing or demonstrating some psychological distress at a very early age. And I obviously took notes on it. I made sure with the research librarians and the archivists that this was legit, that what I was looking at was real. And when I went to get permission to use it in my dissertation, Ted Hughes, who was still alive at the time, denied me that permission. But something else had happened when I went to Smith that sort of led me in a different direction. Obviously, Smith is one of the oldest women's colleges in the United States, and I was in their research library. So, of course, I also was exposed to a lot of really interesting artifacts from the history of Smith. I ended up getting a tour of the campus and all the old housing and all that. And I had always really liked girls' series fiction. And I came back and I had sort of one of those moments that if you've mentored, I'm sure, a number of doctoral candidates, where I suddenly realized I was at a crossroads. And I had taken a course called The Politics of Domesticity with the late, wonderful Cheryl Orvitz, who was an early Americanist, and with P. James Splawn, who was an African-American literature scholar. And it was a wonderful course on 18th, 19th, and early 20th century women's writing and the way that women used domesticity as a strategy to enter the public realm. And based on that class, my experience at Smith, I decided to completely change course and write a dissertation on girls' series fiction. And for anyone listening who's a graduate student, I will tell you what I did. I went to the library and I checked out about 150 books of girls' series fiction, which at the time we had at Purdue, and I put them on one side of my bed. And I sat there and I just started reading and tossing. I would just read them. I wasn't really even sure what I was looking for yet. And about 20 or 30 books in, thankfully, I started to notice a pattern. And the pattern that I noticed was, not only was girls' series fiction written by women who seemed to have a lot of interest in girls' collectivism, because almost every book dealt with girls getting together to do something, but I also started to notice a teleology that began in sort of the 1870s or 1880s and moved forward into the 20th century, where girls were increasingly entering the public realm. So the first wave of series fiction were college girl novels, where the college campus was sort of the green world apart from the real world, where young women formed good friendships, and one or two of them might venture out into the world. But the idea was this was your 4 years to really enjoy yourself before marriage, right? Then there's this whole plethora of outdoor girls of Deepdale, campfire girls, all these sort of outdoor girl texts. And I started to notice too that some African American women writers who were writing for young girls, especially in religious periodicals, were also setting these sort of same dynamics of girls working together to go out into the public realm. And then, of course, the detective fiction for girls and the profession fiction of the 1920s and 30s. So we start having student nurses and Nancy Drew and Judy Bolton. And so there was my thesis, essentially, which was, and the title of the book is the Club Women's Daughters. So I researched the Club Women's movement, wrote a whole chapter on them and how they then spawned this whole generation of women who wrote for girls and encouraged them to really become part of collective impulses in order to find a voice in the public realm. So that's how it came together, and it was not a straight trajectory in any way. But
wow, it's amazing. I love that the archive, led you somewhere else and to somewhere that's so powerfully generative for women and also foundational. I'm thinking here too that this was really in many ways a kind of foundation for later the kind of renaissance of kind of girl power culture. And we now have some of our students working on precisely the 80s and 90s. But I love this. I didn't know about your mom's love of Wonder Woman, but here we have the big book of girl power. Tell me how you might see these kind of in relationship to one another, your kind of work on this foundational spaces, and then of course more sort of girl power scholarship and cultural production.
Right. Well, one of the things I'm sure your students are finding is that the individuals who are engaged in writing children's fiction now are like representative of much more of the reality of American culture and life. In the 19th century, the women who were going to college and who were writing books for girls were almost exclusively white and upper class, or scholarship students, but still in some way carrying a lot of privilege, and their attitudes reflect that, right? I mean, Nancy Drew has been rewritten now, the original volumes more than once in order to edit out a lot of the racism and stereotypical depiction of ethnicity and other issues that are in those texts. What's fascinating, though, is that, and I had toyed with writing a second book that focused on the 1920s onward myself. Happily, I have one former honors college student who's now a professor in SUNY Canton, Emily Hamilton Honey, who's written an amazing book on World War I girls fiction, and also just, I think, co-edited a volume on sort of more 20th century girls fiction. But there's a lot of folks who are doing this work in the 80s and 90s, and that was another sort of renaissance of series fiction for girls, as you know, and I'm sure your students know. And I think what is similar in terms of what carries over is a desire to give girls this idea of being together in order to move forward. And you see that in the Babysitters Club and all the dynamics. And wow, that's a series that has moved into comics and now moved into television, and in ways that continue, I think, to develop these ideas of what it means to be a true friend to someone else. I mean, I know the Spice Girls song, sort of focuses on your friends are more important, but the video kind of undercuts it in a way. But I'm sure your students are finding, again, this idea that young women can find strength. Happily, also, how we even define gender is changing and becoming more inclusive and more open. And I think that we'll find that is paralleled in the work for kids as well.
Oh, absolutely. So comics, children, YA comics, why? I know why, but why for you, Gwen?
Well, I based on my dissertation, I actually was able to secure two jobs, and the one I'm at right now in 1999 at Western Michigan University as a professor of children's and young adult lit. Obviously, this was back in the day before there were a number of dedicated programs to the subject. So most of us who are my age are autodidacts to a certain extent with children's lit. But I had been teaching, not only teaching children's lit, but spending time in the places where kids congregate, especially in bookstores. And I noticed a development in the 1990s, which was kids hanging out in this section called manga. And I went over and started to read the books myself and became interested in them. And then I had a sabbatical, excuse me, in 2005. And I had realized that I had typed the word girl maybe for the last time. I had enjoyed that part of my research, but I was interested in other things. I'd been doing work on picture books. And I decided, all right, I'm an associate professor. I have the time now. And I decided I would devote a number of years to learning visual theory and visual rhetoric, because one of the things I saw missing in not just children's literature scholarship, but in a lot of American comic scholarship was attention to form. And I mean, I can be critical of other people, but I wasn't doing anything about it myself. And so I engaged in this 3-year odyssey of learning about visual theory. And that actually happened a little later because in between I was an administrator and then I got back to research. And so from really 2010 until 2013, I had the opportunity to go to Europe a number of times to do research on Franco-Belgian comics and British comics. And then I had another sabbatical in Canada where I went to Toronto and worked with the Beguiling bookstore and with Toronto Public Schools to figure out what they were doing with children's comics. And then I spent time at the University of Chicago taking some sort of auditing and that sort of thing to learn more about visual theory, to the point where I started writing essays on children's comics. And I sort of was talking about it so much, and my friend, Dr. Michelle Abate, who's at Ohio State with you, said to me, hey, why don't we co-edit a edited collection on children's comics, because we had been teaching these comics and didn't really have any scholarship that was directly related to them to give to our students. And so Michelle and I began working on this collection, which came out ultimately in 2017, that featured, I believe, 21 essays that focused on a lot of very popular children's comics as well as some historical material. So that's how I made this journey. It was really another conscious, abrupt sort of change in what I wanted to focus on.
Gwen, let me ask you, was there something also kind of fresh and open about this space of kids, children, and YA comics that allowed for both a socio-political, cultural, and aesthetic approach?
Mm-hmm. Well, first of all, it's really interesting because I think the people who are writing children's comics have changed. I mean, the sort of profile that you would think of a comics creator of, say, funny comics for kids, or the things that even were sort of hanging on in the 80s and 90s. Usually we think of, you know, someone who's a professional cartoonist, who's mainly writing gag comics and who's been trained in that kind of comics creation. But today's comics creators is typically somewhat different. These are individuals who've gone to art school, who have finally been afforded, at least in North America, the opportunity to study comics in art school, whose theses very often, or web comics, involved children, right? And maybe they were memoirs, like, you know, there's a lot of contemporary comics creators who have written a memoir about their own childhood for adults and then start to move into that. But then there's someone like Drew Wing, who does the Margot Malou series, who actually started that in grad school as a webcomic and then got picked up by First Second Books. So, but it's a group of people who clearly love children's comics, but who have been trained formally as artists. Now that's one group. There are others who are, you know, less sort of moving through that pipeline. But what we have today is a whole plethora of styles and of subject matter and of really genres for children's comics. It has just expanded to the point where, frankly, it's hard to keep up with it. I must admit that if I stop like reading and investigating for even 4 or 5 months, as I did this summer, I'm just floored by the amount of catch up that I would have to do. So
Yeah, tell me about it. And for me, to be honest, it's actually them. Look, there's a lot of amazing stuff out there, but I find myself, um, it's the YA comics that have really captivated me. There's a vitality and energy in that space today that's just, I go to those first, on my bookshelf before anything else. Let me ask you, and just a year after your edited volume, you published your monograph, your children's and young adult comics, and there you mention comics as the language of the future. And I know you're quoting here, but tell me like what that means to you in the context of your work. And maybe also we can talk a little bit about some of these comics that we have up on the slide in relation to that, and in relation to your approach that's both mindful of the socio-political and also the aesthetic.
yeah, the person you're quoting is Andrew Aden, who was one of the collaborators with John Lewis, along with Nate Powell, writing the March series, and it was actually a speech that he was giving to a group of young people about comics, and he was pointing out we have to create artifacts that are communicating in the way that you prefer to communicate. And his argument was that we are just increasingly visual culture, and that visual rhetoric is an important aspect of young people's lives and is only going to become more important. I do agree with that. I think that that we're in an interesting place because on the one hand, you have almost every mainstream publisher now in North America creating an imprint, a comics imprint. And their concern is both, I think, making sure that books will be appealing to educators and librarians and parents in terms of their literacy concerns, while also giving the sort of considerable resources that they have to allow these really high art publications that are visually stunning and cost a certain amount of money to make, right? So if you're looking at the slides right now, up in the upper left-hand corner is a cover of one of the Hereville series written by the amazing Barry Deutsch, who's also a political cartoonist. So, and he's a wonderful person. He's come and talked to my classes. He's extremely generous with his time. He created this amazing middle grade series called Hereville, which focuses on a young Jewish Orthodox girl growing up in Iowa in contemporary times. But the text also is infused with magical realism. Mirka is a 10-year-old girl. Or is she 11? Oh dear, I think she's 10 or 11. She's young. She's a tween. And she is very interested in action and adventure. She wants to fight battles with a great sword. And she lives, though, in a society where she is expected to start becoming more ladylike, more invested in domesticity. And her knitting needles sort of become, in a way, a symbol for her of the sword that she wants to wield. And I won't give away any more of the story because it's an enchanting story, but the point I want to make is it's also aesthetically beautiful and very detailed and full of color, and color drives the narrative. And so it's Abrams who put this out, and they can afford to support a book like that. And that's a far cry from some of the more independent comics publishers who are putting out mainly black and white comics for kids. So there's that whole range. And it's important to capture, I think, the various ways that children can interact with comics, because there's Toon Comics with Françoise Mouly, who's hired Kimberly Guise to be their sort of education guru, the person who helps them to communicate with parents and educators. You've got, for a second, you've got Random House with Gina Gagliano now running their imprint for kids. But then you also have DC and Marvel investing more in children's comics. You have Lion Forge that was bought up by Ani, who's now doing more of that. And then again, you have web comics creators, independent creators. So kids are being exposed to comics of all types, and that really is what is so different today, right? And it's not always rosy either. I'm in the middle of doing some work. I'm trying to finish up an essay for Cambridge, the Cambridge Handbook Children's Lit. I'm trying to finish up my essay on children's and young adult comics for them, and I've been doing a lot of thinking about both the really positive aspects of the professionalization of children's comics, but some of the potential downsides too. What does it mean for a comics creator who wants to create a really chaotic comic where part of the joy of reading it is actually trying to figure out what the heck is going on? Is that going to pass muster with an editor who's concerned about literacy issues and getting this into the hands of a third grade teacher somewhere? What does that mean? So, I'm a part, probably some of my research going forward is going to focus on interviewing comics creators for children about their aesthetics process and how much they feel that is now in any way under discussion. And it may be that I'm surmising incorrectly. I mean, think about Camp Midnight. It's Jason Segel and no, it's Jason Katz. Oh, Jesus, it's Segel and Katzenstein. I may get their first names messed up, and I'm sorry, guys, if I'm doing that. But their Camp Midnight series is amazing. It is so experimental, and it's come out, and I think to great acclaim. So I don't even think that it's a hindrance, but it's something to think about. And then the other comic that you have here is Gill's Talented 10th. And this is someone who basically felt like, where is the representation of African-American children's history? And in comics, where is it? I mean, he was coming up right about the same time that March was coming out, but he was saying, I mean, that's one instance. He's like, where is the history? And so he started to do this amazing comic called The Talented 10th, referencing the late 19th, early 20th century credo that the talented among the Black community needed to reach back and bring everyone up with them, right? And that concept of, basically Gill is saying, who were some of these people who were important figures in African-American culture and history? And the example that you're showing is his comic on Bass Reeves. And he does something stylistically which is fascinating. And I'm sure that if you've looked at this comic, you'll know what I'm talking about. But he wanted to realistically portray the way that Black folks were treated during the Jim Crow era, and the way that white people specifically expressed their white supremacy. And he did so symbolically, first of all, by having white supremacists often depicted as actual crows, whereas everybody else was sort of a human figure. But he also wanted a way to incorporate the N-word into the comic coming out of the mouth of the white supremacist. And he did that by having a minstrel face stand in for it. This is incredibly creative. I wonder how a teacher would handle it in the classroom, because this is a very explosive, potentially hurtful topic. And so I'm not in any way knocking what Gill's doing, because I think it's incredibly inventive, and it truly does express the horrific way that white supremacy manifests itself in our culture. And it does it so creatively, and yet I wonder how young children would respond to it. And I don't know the answer to that, but I felt like I had to feature this text because I think that what Gill is doing is really profound and fascinating.
I love, thank you so much for, in kind of action, showing us how form and content are so intricately interwoven in comics for kids. And of course, pointing us to race and issues of race in the space of children's and YA fiction. I know Michelle, my colleague here, has written even on Raina Telgemeier's kind of run, and in a way a kind of absenting of race in that space. But I know you've written on and thought about very deeply Tintin and Hergé and the coloniality of power.
Yeah, I actually had never read any Hergé until I started studying Franco-Belgian comics, I'll admit. I mean, I knew it existed, but I just hadn't had a deep interest in it. And then I read most of it. And I do have to hat tip Michael Marbury, who was a doctoral candidate in our program a number of years back, who helped me, because initially the way I got into writing about Hergé was Joe Sutliff Sanders, who's at Cambridge now, had asked me to contribute to his lovely volume, which I have here, called The Comics of Hergé, When the Lines Are Not So Clear, which is a pun on the clear line style, obviously. And I had said, well, yeah, I'd love to write an essay on Jean Lewin Yang and what he does with the clear line style versus what Hergé did. Well, in doing that, of course, I had to read extensively in Hergé. And obviously, the first thing I came up against not only was the way that indigenous cultures were portrayed by the Belgian comics creator Hergé, or Georges Remy, but also to a certain extent, the complex way that his work had already been discussed in Franco-Belgian scholarship. Some scholars sort of adopting a critical race theory vantage point, other scholars to a certain extent trying to contextualize the comics within their time period. In other words, that same tension that we see in North America when we discuss problematic and clearly racist depictions. And so that was sort of my first foray, and I did write a little bit about that because I've compared the way that Hergé treats violence in The Blue Lotus, which is a comic set in China and features one of the youth protagonists who appears repeatedly in the Tintin series, Chang. And this was based upon Hergé's working with a young exchange student from China who educated Hergé on a lot of the politics in China. And therefore, many people have said, compared to some of his other comics, The Blue Lotus actually does try to depict China in at least a somewhat less patronizing way. Nonetheless, the Japanese are depicted in the book in an extremely stereotypical way, so we really have to have that little asterisk. And that was my first foray, because then I looked at Jean Lewin Yang, who was writing on the Boxers' Rebellion, and did a comparison on violence. I actually have an essay that will hopefully come out this year in a collection that's coming out through Routledge on Tintin. And it's actually, I had to look it up because it's been 2 years since I wrote it, but it deals with the 3 child characters in Tintin. Because even though Tintin is thought of as a children's comic, the boy reporter Tintin is actually old enough to go all around the world and afford all of his travels and all of that kind of thing. And there are very few children in Hergé's comics, and at least in this particular comic. And there are 3, though, and all of them are indigenous children. There's Chang, whom I've already mentioned. There's Zorino, who's a Peruvian child. And then there's, I believe it's Mohammed, who's a young child from an unspecified Middle Eastern country. And what's fascinating to me is that in all 3 of these instances, Hergé is doing something different but problematic. So with Chang, there's sort of the white savior paternalism that goes on between Tintin and Chang. With the depiction of Zorino, there's this very intricate 2-book series of events that lead the young boy to call into question his own culture and to break from it in favor of Western culture, which is problematic in its own way. And then, interestingly, in the text, the Black Gold text, where Tintin goes to the Middle East and gets wrapped up in some oil issues with the British, etc., the young child in this text actually is defiant, wants nothing to do with Tintin. And Tintin throws his hands up at the end and says, there's nothing I can do with this child. And so if you're looking for sort of a history of Hergé's engagement with indigenous culture, looking at moving from Chang to Zorino, then to Muhammad, I think that's his name, and I'd have to look it up. It's been a while since I've written on this. But the point is that these characters are, yes, very stereotypically depicted. But then even within that, different aspects of colonial behavior emerge in these texts as characters are othered. Yeah.
So you brought up, of course, this incredible comic by Jean Lun
Yes.
Yang and violence. Tell me about that and how violence in kind of comics for YA or for kids in general, and then also comics written from the perspective of an historically underrepresented creator.
Well, it's interesting because, of course, comics had its origin in gag writing, and gags are very often physical. So you can look back at what many people point to 19th century origin texts for contemporary comics, and you can see they're riddled with violence, whether children are in them or not. So it's not so much that violence is uncommon in children's comics. It's what my question was, how does form impact how violence is expressed? The clear line style has so often been associated not only with children's comics, but with lighthearted themes. And that's understandable because many comics creators have used that format for what are very often domestic comics or animal funny comics, etc. And so the question I started to ask myself was, how does violence really manifest itself in clear line? And is it as effective, or does it play out differently than in what we more traditionally associate in contemporary times with comics that deal with violence and war, such as those of Jacques Tardi or Joe Sacco, or just a lot of comics creators who write about geopolitical issues and use the black and white format. I'm thinking of even Persepolis, which has a more iconic style but is in black and white and has shading and hatching. And in fact, in some of the passages where Marjan either witnesses violence or experiences it, there's a lot of grays or muddiness, but still it's not clear line in the pure sense. Well, I asked myself this question because I was just sort of curious, because one of the things I'd thought about was, well, if I pick up, it was a War of the Trenches, and I open it up, I don't even have to read a single word to know that this is a heavy, serious topic that I need to approach in that mood, right? But you pick up the first couple pages of any Jean Lun Yang comic, and you have to use your skills as a reader, and you have to really contemplate what's happening, because while ultimately there will be some cartoony violence, and you show some slides which are very much in the superhero genre type style, there's actually most of the really serious violence that's personal between characters in Yang's text are done in very muted colors, are done in, very often there's an absence where the violence is taking place and it's taking place, but you're not seeing it at that moment. You're given evidence that it's taken place. And it led me to start thinking about how, because everything in a clear line comic, the incidental is often removed, it actually may serve as a more effective way of highlighting violence, because as you're reading along, there it is, and there's no shading, there's no nothing to sort of hide it. It's right there. And so I can't pretend that I have all of the answers about how form impacts violence, but I was able to show, I think pretty convincingly, that Yang had read Hergé, that he had taken to heart Hergé's comment about removing incidental backgrounds when you want to feature something and really get the reader's attention. And he actually does follow through with that. And I had written to him, not a leading question, but I had simply asked him, about his choices, his aesthetic choices. And he did reveal that he felt it was important, especially when teaching young people history, to make sure that when he wanted to get a historical point across, that the panels were very clearly laid out and that there wasn't a lot of confusion about what he was trying to express. So to answer that part, that's sort of what led me to ask these questions. But then you get to the very important point about underrepresented groups and their depiction in comics. And you and I both know there's a long history of stereotypical depictions of non-white people in comics and of people in the LGBTQ community. And it then falls upon comics creators in the contemporary world to try to address that. There's an independent comic that's actually unfortunately hard to get a hold of, that was drawn by Lucy Nisley, who's quite well known for her memoir comics, and Erica Moen, who's quite well known for her interest in depicting human sexuality. And they drew a comic together because both of them in one way or another identify as being queer. And the thesis of their comic was, we ourselves identify in this way. We never get criticism when we draw ourselves. But when we draw our queer friends or queer people, we sometimes get criticism for how we've depicted them. And the point of their comic was, this is really hard because visual signs are so instantaneous and the culture has been so saturated with negative stereotypes. How does even a respectful comics creator, even a comics creator within a particular designated culture, has, I think, challenges because their work is constantly in dialogue with that lengthy and very heavy oppressive history of comics as caricature and as stereotype. So it's something that I think if your listeners are grad students and they're thinking about pursuing a career in comic studies, thinking about how you just have to really approach the study of visual theory respectfully, understanding that you're dealing with a field where there aren't a lot of easy answers and where you're going to constantly need to problematize representation.
Wow, so powerful and so beautifully expressed. Thank you, Gwen. I know that you were, there for your students, with your students. You're an award-winning teacher. Tell me, what is you shared some, but is there a kind of Gwen Tarbox method approach to teaching comics?
Yes, there is actually, and it's taken me over a decade to figure this out. So, and I have to really hat tip to so many of my colleagues in the field. Most notably, I think everyone looks to Charles Hatfield and to Carol Tilley and Phil Nell and Natalie Optebeek, and I could go on, and Joe Sullivan Sanders and Michelle and others who are doing this wonderful scholarship. And that helps because it means I have something to bring into the classroom. But I teach two different populations when I teach comics. The first are students who are taking my undergraduate foundational courses in children's lit or YA lit. And for them, because they bring less experience, I tend to ease them in to the study of comics by having them begin with illustrated text, picture books, getting them used to some of the language that we use when we do visual interpretation. We usually move to film and talk about adaptation. And then we move into usually a hybrid comic. So they start to see how words and images interact, but then how a lot of people like to use Selznick's Hugo Cabret or something like that to show them, look, part of the narrative, there's no words, then we go back to words. And then finally we get into comics. And one of the reasons I wrote my book, Children's and Young Adult Comics, is because I really wish that there had been some sort of formal program that I could use to teach comics form to students. And what I did in the book is really, especially the 4th and 5th chapters, I talk about the different aspects of comic form with examples, and then I do some analysis of some key comic texts to show examples of that. And so I'll do, like this semester I'm teaching, I think Smile is the first comic I'm teaching in my middle grade class, and students will read on comics form and they'll start to practice working with spreads. Typically I ask students to look for repetitions within the comic and to learn how to feel comfortable writing about a comic spread where I always tell them, pretend that the person reading it doesn't have that comic in front of them. You have to learn how, in a not clunky way, to describe it so that people who are reading it and don't have it in front of them can understand it. So a lot of it is just getting students to get over their anxiety, these beginning students, with terminology and the structuring of sort of expressing what they think about a comic. At the grad level, I teach a course called Introduction to Grad Studies, and I've also, like I just finished, I taught a course called Immigrant and Refugee Comics, which was really unfortunately interrupted by COVID-19, but had started off as an amazing in-person experience. With grad students, it's a little easier, of course, because they bring years of reading other types of form. With them, it's convincing them that the narrative is driven by visuals. Because Frederick, for all of us who, if you began as a literary scholar, I did, I'm used to the idea of words driving the narrative. You have to really work against that to become an effective comics scholar. And so I spend a lot of the first half of the semester helping my students to get to a place where they not only can accept that, but then can not only look at how words and images work together, but can also learn to write on silent comics. And that's actually in preparation for our qualifying exam in comics, which we do have. And a lot of our students choose that because we have a 3-exam requirement right now. And as you can imagine, most students are not specializing in 3 areas. And so many of them choose to do our coursework in comics and have a 3rd area. And many of them have found it's helped them on the job market. So for people who are listening to this who have graduate programs, our students are finding that employers there may not be a lot of jobs in comic studies, but if someone brings comic studies as one of their competencies, it's being received well. So that's good.
So good to hear that. So good. And we do a lot of teaching by other means, including this very popcast, comic cast that we're doing right now. What are some of the other means that you see yourself teaching comics?
Well, you brought up comics podcasts. For almost 3 years. I did a children's comics podcast with the Comics Alternative. This was a wonderful podcast that I'm sure you know of. It was set up by the late departed wonderful Derek Royal, who was my peer in grad school, my editor for my last volume. Sadly, he passed a week after I turned in my manuscript, which is very sad. And Andy Kunka. And we all knew each other in grad school. And for 3 years, first with Andy Wolverton, then with Paul Lai, and then with Crystal Howard, I did a children's podcast. And podcasting is one of the things that I'm working on integrating into my courses. I'm having this semester, my students are doing flipboard videos with comics, where they're going to interpret comics pages. My students like video. That they have told me that. So we're going to be doing a lot more of that. And I think it's a really good medium because students are able to also think about the construction of the video while they're also talking about the construction of the comic. Some of them I think will get pretty creative with how they do that, how they address the sort of visual aspect of interpretation. So yeah, those are some of the tools that I use. I also encourage students to draw comics. And we use some of Linda Berry's wonderful exercises. And I've found that students really start to understand sequential art better when they have to try and draw a comic themselves.
So yeah, absolutely. I agree with that. And we mentioned we're talking about new generations of comics scholars, even those working in literature, but having that kind of training at some point in their career. Why is it, in many ways for me, this sort of Comic Studies Society and other associations kind of serve that function, right? Because a lot of departments don't have comic studies. But tell me why comic studies forums and societies for you?
Well, one of the things that I realized very early on, and I'm fortunate because French was one of the languages I studied in school, so I was able to make the transition to studying Franco-Belgian comics, and I felt it was essential because so much of the important comics theory of the last 30 years has emerged out of Belgium and France. And many of the scholars there are so generous. Pascal Lefebvre, Jan Batens, Thierry Grunstein, and Miller, so many others who write on the bande dessinée have been so kind to me and tolerant of my terrible pronunciation of French. I think that if you're interested in becoming a comic scholar, you need to, of course, understand North American comics, but then you need to know at least one of the other traditions. I went into comic studies in my mid to late 40s. I would love to learn Japanese, but I realized that probably for me, that ship had probably sailed. I encourage my students, and in fact, at Western, we have a wonderful, world languages program, and some of our students are very interested in pursuing that. But for me, it was more the Franco-Belgian. But you need to know at least one of these other histories well and know all of them. And every culture has comics. I'm currently beginning more exploration, both because of sort of students I've had who are from Southeast Asia, and they're like, "When there's a whole comics world here you need to know about." So I will be learning more about that. But these organizations help facilitate that, whether it's our wonderful Comic Studies Society or ICAF or TCAF up in Toronto, or all of the wonderful work that's done out of the museum, the comics museums on the continent. And that's starting to happen really big time in England with master's programs at Durham and in London. It's really important to learn about not just the comics in your culture or that interest you, because believe it or not, I do actually read superhero comics. I don't write a lot on them, but I read them and I keep up with what's going on with those as well. But it gives you a broader understanding and allows you to really get a handle on how culture impacts art and interpretation. So highly recommend anyone starting out in comic studies to read widely in the many journals we have, many of them sponsored by these organizations, and to attend a conference. Because of COVID, it's been a while since I've gotten together with my comics friends, and I missed that. But it's a very vibrant community, and I think it really helps junior scholars test out their ideas, and hopefully someday comics will be a field where we're hiring and teaching it more aggressively, because students not only love it, they need it. I think, visual literacy, and this is one way to get it, there are many ways, but visual literacy is just very important.
Couldn't agree with you more. So Gwen, as we start to wind this down, where do you see the vitality in comics? And in a way, you've already started to answer that, which is kind of planetary comics, right? A global sense of the kind of vitality coming from all these different spaces. But tell me how you would answer this question.
I think that it's important also to not sort of forget about independent comics and web comics. A lot of the innovation, a lot of the mainstream comics creators of tomorrow are today creating comics online, sharing them with their friends. Many of them are doing self-publishing or working with some of the smaller, really great presses like Avery Hill in Britain, or, well, Drawn and Quarterly isn't a small press, it's a major press, but it has kept to its independent roots. I also think that, it's interesting because a couple of years ago, I read some comics for the Comics Alternative podcast that I was doing with Derek Royal. We were doing a more of an adult version, and there were a couple comics we read that just blew me away. One was by Brecht and was called Leopard, and the other was by Nick Dresno, and it was called Beverly. And both of them had some mainstream success. Both of them were depicting childhood, and for adults, I might add, these were adult comics, but in such a visceral way where the inner life of children was portrayed in an aching sort of intimacy and detail. These are, by the way, very serious comics that deal with abuse and also with children and mental illness. So these are not light comics in any way. I want to warn anyone who's going to read them, but they're powerful. And in those comics, I saw what I think is one of the waves of the future, which is the comics is going to begin to vie with text in terms of depicting the inner perspective, the inner life. And it's not that hasn't already happened. And I'm sure people are sitting here saying, but wait, when there was this comic that came out in 1977 that was doing it, But what I'm talking about is like more and more comics creators are using the comics medium and the visual medium to express inner life in ways that are extremely sophisticated. And I think that as comics creators go through sort of a more formal education in art, but also begin to see these examples around them, I think we're headed for some really, really interesting experimental work in the future, and that really excites me.
Taking us right back to where we began, comics is the language, is the narrative of the future. So you mentioned a couple things you're working on. Maybe you can highlight a few of these. What do we have to look forward to?
Well, I have an article that I'll be finishing probably by mid-May, I hope, on the Beatles in comics of the 1960s. I'm interested in the way specifically young women are portrayed as fans of the Beatles. And I think we're seeing, I'm showing that there are a lot of adult anxieties regarding young women and fandom that emerge in the 60s. And so I'm using Beatles comics as a launching pad for that. And I want to thank my university for funding my very expensive purchases of these comics, because as you can imagine, they're now collector's items. And so I was very fortunate to get a grant from the College of Arts and Sciences at Western Michigan University. I want to thank them for that. I also had wanted to write a book. And notice it's in the past tense. I was planning to go to England and do some research on young people's communities and the way that young people sort of collaborated with each other culturally prior to the internet, and especially interested both in visual culture but also in music culture. And that was the plan. And then the pandemic hit, and I've had to try to imagine a research project that I can do, if not only from the comfort of my own home. Certainly I'm right near Michigan State and I'm near the Billy Ireland, that I can do more domestically until international travel is more predictable. And so I'm now sort of pondering maybe a comic on intersubjectivity, a very specific type of intersubjectivity in comics, and see where that goes. So starting this summer, that will probably be something that I'm working on for about the next year.
So excited, so excited. What can I say? Gwen, Athene, Tarbox, thank you for gifting us your time, your experience, your expertise, your knowledge. Youth and comics matter.
Yes, they do. And thank you for not only giving me this platform, but giving so many comics creators, well, not creators, but actual scholars, the chance to talk about our work and to hopefully get people interested in studying comics. It's a really important field. So thank you very much.